Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Mark Simon Schar. I'm the CFO of Outokumpu, and we have the pleasure to host today's event. I think we have a very interesting, but also at the same time, important topic. And this is about how will the green transition play out in the age of geopolitics. With that one, thank you so much for your interest joining us today for the panel discussion. And with that one, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Laura.
Thank you so much, Mark Simon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for Outokumpu for hosting this fascinating, and I think you'll all agree, extremely timely discussion. The politics of climate, how will the green transition play out in the age of geopolitics? I was a journalist with the BBC for 30 years. I'm still a journalist, but I advocate for the Caribbean's reparatory justice agenda, which, by the way, does include climate, because the former British colonies in the Caribbean are really in the front line of climate change. And Hurricane Beryl in July destroyed the Grenadian islands of Carriacou and Petit Martinique. And my ancestors actually were enslavers in Grenada and played a part in bringing people there today whose ancestors were kidnapped from Africa. So to me, there is a through line from the past to the present, and I was delighted to be asked to moderate this panel. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. As you, Mark Simon Schar, needs no introduction, CFO of Outokumpu. And Outokumpu, by the way, are the world's leading producers of sustainable stainless steel, which I think we'll all agree is definitely the future, and we'll hear more about that. Then we have with us Cal Allen. Cal is the Vice President and General Manager for Environment Business at Hitachi. Thank you so much, Cal. Then we have Annika Hedberg. Annika is a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and will be doing her best to give us the 30,000 foot on the geopolitics. And then we have also with us Vamsi Allah. Vamsi is the Managing Director, Corporate Advisory and Sustainability at JP Morgan. So it's great to have everyone here. And as I'm sure you'll all agree, with a US presidential election looming, the geopolitics of climate couldn't be a more timely subject for this discussion. So before we dive right in, I'm just going to ask all our panelists to give us their headlines, their minute thoughts on our big topic today, the politics of climate. How will the green transition play out in the age of geopolitics? And I'm going to ask our host, Mark Simon, to take it away.
Thank you, Laura. Indeed, we are living in a polarizing world and an increasing geopolitical tension and a trend towards deglobalization. However, we must act now. Climate change doesn't wait for us to get our act together. We all live on one planet, and we need to move forward over here. And we need to remember that the green transition, is a long-term goal and should not be influenced by current geopolitical tensions over here. As a corporate company, we also not change our long-term strategy just because of a change in or having a bad quarter or bad year overall. And I think this is important to remember. When looking from an Outokumpu side, I think here we are can clearly say that we were the ones first in the industry who have committed themselves to the Paris Agreement of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. And with that one, we aim to reduce our emissions by the end of the decade by 42% against the baseline of 2016. We have so far achieved 27% of that one, and our carbon footprint is 75% lower than the industry average over here. And we have achieved this all even during the times of all different crises, being COVID, being the trade war, be it the Ukraine crisis. So my point here is that profitability and sustainability are not mutually exclusive and should and can go hand in hand. But it requires also clear commitment from corporates and especially the tone from the top. Important on top of that is also the support from the governmental side in here, that we have the government providing us with a level playing field. And with that one, I mean to have an alignment on the global carbon pricing, which should incentivize companies then to invest into the green transition over here. With that income money, then the government can invest into infrastructure, particularly on the electricity side, because we definitely need clean and affordable energy going forward into technology and R&D, as well as basic research in here. So with that one,
thank you so much, Mark Simon, for the long minute, but that was a fantastic overview. Cal, just tell us, from your perspective at Hitachi, the politics of climate, how is the green transition going to play out in this era?
I would say that absolutely we see the momentum, we see the attention, we see the movement that is currently taking place. It's accelerating, it's moving very, very quickly. I have attended a renewable event a couple of weeks back, and I compare it with the same event 2 years before. The amount of exhibitors around technologies that are ready to be deployed in the green transition at least have been doubled. At least have been doubled. Geopolitics absolutely is going to play out significantly into this. The competition over the raw material, which is very important in this transition. The trade tension, which is currently going on, is also part of this discussion. So there are lots of things that we see, but to your point, I don't think that the momentum that currently is taking place is going to be stopped because of any change.
Okay, that's the view from Hitachi, which is very encouraging. But Annika, what about you? You study global trends there in Washington at the Atlantic Council. How do you feel about this topic in the era of all these headwinds geopolitically?
I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that we can't separate geopolitics from climate change. It's how we work together will define how effectively we'll be able to address the climate crisis. It will have impacts, whether we'll have access to the resources, the know-how, the solutions that we need for the green transition. But then at the same time, what happens with climate change will have and is increasingly having enormous impacts on geopolitics. And we know that these tensions will continue to rise. Just imagine the scenario where droughts are leading into conflicts over water, or where we have climate-induced refugee crisis. This will have huge implications on our feeling of security and on geopolitics. So taking into consideration what's at stake, it's essential that even in this world where we feel that we are being polarized and everyone is playing their own game, we find the partners, we work together where we can, when we can, and we take that action to work together to find solutions and get the best solutions on the market and to those people that desperately need them. There's no time to waste, and we need to act now. And I would like to finish off just with saying that it's the time, that is the topic this week. It's the time to stop silo thinking. We need a holistic approach where we actually align our short and long-term priorities. We look into how can we get and work in a way that we meet our priorities, the goals for security, for economic growth, for climate, for environment, for people's well-being, and we need to find a way how we actually are trying to meet these priorities all at the same time. It's the road to no regrets. Thanks.
Annika, thank you. And Vamsi, as an investor from JP Morgan, what are your headlines on the politics of climate and how it's all playing out in this age of increasingly fraught geopolitics, it feels like?
Yep. Again, as the finance guy on the panel here, you're going to hear a lot of dollars that I'm going to talk here. So I think, look, big picture, when we think about what the world is targeting, we talk about the Paris Agreement, which is clearly the goal to decarbonize and reduce emissions. But if you think of how individual country policy is being developed, you have to think of a trifecta of issues, right? So countries are simultaneously trying to decarbonize while trying to maintain energy security and energy affordability. And a lot of policies need to solve for all of these things for them to have a good buy-in from the society. They cannot single-handedly pursue one angle. As we see that if costs go up, the support for decarbonization might come down, and that is the challenge when countries are making these policies. In spite of all of that, we are seeing that International Energy Agency has for 2024 mentioned that close to $2 trillion is going to be spent on energy transition, and this was roughly double from the last 10 years. So that's a good sign that the dollars are increasingly going towards energy transition, and this is true across like US, Europe, and increasingly in China, which is a bigger player. But emerging markets are not getting the right dollars at the right areas. So we need to like think about how to facilitate finance in not just in mature technologies, but also how do you get dollars to harder to abate sectors like emerging economies, and think about that.
Thank you so much to everybody for their overview. So let's dive right into it then with the geopolitics. As some of you may know, there's going to be an election here in America in less than 50 days' time. And as I'm sure you all know, the two candidates have very, very different views on climate policy. Donald Trump has said that if re-elected, he would claw back any money that isn't spent under the Inflation Reduction Act. He would take the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement again, and possibly even out of the UN regulatory framework altogether. So I'd like to start, if I could, with Mark Simon. I know that you were just in Washington. You've been doing a fact-finding mission. I know that you're in Finland, Outokumpu, so maybe it doesn't directly affect you. But if the US election results in a different party in power, what would that mean for the green transition? I think we can see that a President Harris would mean a continuation of the policies, but what about a President Trump? Would that affect you and your business?
Well, first of all, I need to say that as Outokumpu, we have also operations and business in the Americas, in the US, and therefore it does matter to us as well. Well, yeah, difficult to judge now on who's going to win the elections, but I think what's important is, and no matter which candidate, and I think you were referring to Trump coming into administration back again, we have to deal with that situation. And as Annika was saying, I mean, what we are missing and lagging is the global alignment, is the global collaboration on and cooperation on the green transition here as well. So I think for me, what's essentially important is that we keep the dialogue in here, and that especially from the transatlantic partnership which we are having, that we are in a position to find an efficient and effective level playing field for us, for our companies, in order to have the right incentives in place to invest and to drive the green transition in here. And again, as I said at the beginning, for me the most efficient way is to have an alignment on the global carbon pricing. But because that is really driving then and allowing the companies to invest and to make a change. And as said, we need to act now, and it doesn't matter who is in place.
And Vamsi, we were chatting earlier, and you were saying that with the Inflation Reduction Act, quite a lot of the money has been spent already. So could it really be unwound by a future president?
So I know when we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, like it's not, I mean, it's a very big bill, but it's not one monolith. So we have to think about, like, within that act, where are the provisions, and how is sort of grassroots support for different of those provisions, right? So if we start with, obviously the act has extended the provisions for build out of solar and wind energy, and also added provisions to support energy storage, which is increasingly becoming important as more and more renewables enter our grid. We need energy storage to sort of like manage the grid in an efficient way. So those provisions for solar and wind have been a long stay in the US tax code. So we can, again, everyone can be a judge of like what's the likelihood if that's been a program for a long time. So then next, if we come to the next biggest impact of an Inflation Reduction Act has been in battery technologies and the manufacturing that came around with it, right? So again, several companies have announced both the auto OEMs, auto manufacturers, and the large battery companies have announced investments in states like Georgia, South Carolina, like Ohio, and the likes, again, what people are calling the new battery belt. These manufacturing investments tend to be in rural regions. Obviously, you need a big land base and skill set to build out there. So again, one of the trends we are seeing as we speak to clients is that there should be a lot of grassroots support for the jobs that are being created for those that might create a bit of a headwind if a new administration tries to undo those things.
Fascinating. And Cal, from your perspective at Hitachi, what do you see as the biggest global headwinds impeding the green transition?
Well, I would say that definitely one of the major things that needs to be resolved is the global cooperation. So global cooperation is necessary to achieve the 2015 goals. So currently, yes, there are trade policies, there are incentives to have more local capacity, but those are all considered short-term goals. They have to be part of a long-term strategy. And the strategy is clear. We have to resolve the global tension about trade. It has to be part of the solution. You cannot only build capacity and depend on resources that are built in the country, because that is against globalization that will delay achieving the goals. So I would say this is one of the most important points, and this is an area where international institutions needs to play a big role, bringing everybody on a platform that they can talk, they can resolve, neutralize these tensions, and find a way to use capacity in countries that have extra capacity that we can currently leverage in different countries. Find a way to share the raw material, to have access to raw material that is necessary to build and quickly scale those type of green projects.
That sounds utopian and very wonderful. Annika, do you think that there's much prospect of that, of countries sharing and in places where there's overcapacity? Or do you see a world of protectionism where the US and China are basically sticking tariffs on each other's green industries and we see protectionism?
I have to be a realist. I think that we certainly have always had and will continue to have countries looking into what is in their self-interest. I think the question becomes is that what is the form this self-interest takes, and at what point do the countries actually recognize that it's in their self-interest to take collective action and work together. I am also realistic that at the moment there are tensions. We do have blocks being formed where, whether it's around themes, whether it's around regions, countries are looking into how can they work together, perhaps in smaller groups. And it can also actually lead to some efficiencies. I'm not saying it's an ideal world, but if we get countries, other stakeholders, work together, form collective action around themes in regions, they can actually bring efficiencies. They can try to create markets where they get the solutions much more effectively to those that need them. So I do see hope. Also, I would just like to mention around climate change. This actually has been the one area where we have continued to see collaboration over the years, even when we've had extremely difficult times, otherwise geopolitically. So climate action has remained a vehicle for foreign policy, which has kept the channels open between countries. And I think that provides an extremely valuable basis on which to build on. There is a global understanding that this is a global challenge that requires global solutions. And ultimately, we need to recognize that it's in all of our self-interest to find partners and work together in finding solutions.
Thank you. Well, of course, world leaders are in town this week, just across town for the United Nations General Debate. And the United Nations remains the premier forum for climate negotiation. The COP29 meeting will be in Azerbaijan in November, shortly after the US presidential election. And Mark Simon, how useful do you find the framework of the COP framework is for you at Outokumpu as setting out a roadmap?
I think it's very, very important for us going forward, and we're a big promoter here as well, had been as well here at the COP, the last COP, and supporting that one. I think what is for us in the industry very, very important is the access to affordable and clean energy. And that is one of the main topics going forward. For us, I think, but also for the planet itself. I mean, we see developing countries, we see energy efficiency topics going forward, that is clear, but the need of energy is exponentially increasing. And here specifically, if I refer to megatrends such as artificial intelligence and the data centers, which consume a significant amount of energy going forward. When we look into developing countries such as India or Africa, then here, and together with global warming as well, the need for air conditioning is going to increase. And if we think about the consumption of air conditioning globally, then out of the supply of energy, 10% is going into air conditioning. And given these mega trends, it is expected that this is going to increase to 35% even, right? So we need to find a solution around energy. Significant further investments and support in terms of renewable, absolutely. But I'm afraid that this is not enough. And at the last COP, 20 countries out of four regions have declared their ambition to triple their nuclear energy. Now, is nuclear energy something long-term we are finding as the best solution? Probably not. We in Finland, meanwhile, have and worldwide the only the permanent solution for nuclear waste over here. But that is something we really need to work on in terms of energy.
Well, you've raised this very important question about the green transition and how can it be fueled by clean energy. So I think we should turn to Vamsi, because you're tracking who's spending what on clean energy. And what do you see? Can you give us a global overview? Who's investing the most in clean energy? Is it China?
So coming back to the previous number I was speaking about, so we're roughly like tracking around $2 trillion in investment, which is across clean energy supply and the demand side sectors like transport or industrial heat and things like that, right? So of that $2 trillion, around 1.2 trillion is going into clean energy supply, which is build out of renewables, build out of grid modernization, and then another 700 to 800 billion going into demand side sectors. Now, once we look at that 1.2 trillion, roughly 400 billion comes from China, and another 400 billion comes from US and Europe together. So clearly, like, China is a bigger proportion of the investment. And if we think about it, if we go back to the more fundamental economics, there is a reason for that, right? Like, which is US is a net fossil fuel positive country, right? Like, there is tremendous amount of like gas, oil here, and if you see historically, different countries have built their energy systems to match like what their strengths in supply are. For example, like Brazilian electricity grid is mostly hydro. US like leans gas, and Norway's electricity is hydro. India and China predominantly, like, again, the current grids are coal, because coal is like sort of natively available there, right? So when we think about energy transition, we are, the countries are trying to rewire from what has been like the cheapest way to like source their energy, and then now they're adding the additional ingredient of like what is the lowest carbon way to do that. And we are seeing like countries like China, like where they don't have like a lot of fossil resources other than coal, then transitioning to like the rapid build out of solar and wind and battery storage. So I think as economics becomes clear, like that those sources are becoming cheaper and cheaper, the countries that are adding new capacity will find that those are the sources they want to add. More and more.
Interesting. And Cal, from where you sit at Hitachi, do you see the investment that's needed that Mark Simon's talking about in clean energy? Do you think it's happening?
Well, we see lots of investment going into green technologies. both for developed and in developing countries as well. So we see Europe, for example, in 2022 invested around 28 billion euros for developing countries. We definitely need to accelerate much further than that. It has to be in the range of hundreds of billions and then even to trillions to reach that. We see the private sector investing a lot. The IRA is a great example of that. And there are similar initiatives in Europe and in Canada and in other countries. We see private investors also, they have the appetite around investing in green technologies. There is definitely private being private, they favor the investments that will bring higher returns. But this is where a public-private partnership will make sense to maybe de-risk some of those projects or provide incentives that can bridge the gap. But we see the money, absolutely. We start to see the money. Is it enough? It's not enough. So it needs to accelerate, it needs to go further. There are definitely a bigger role to play for the international funding entities.
Do you mean the World Bank and the IMF?
Exactly. Yeah. To make sure that they're bridging between, or they're the bridge between the developing and the developed countries, so that the funding is going to the countries that need it most. And it's also used to bring up those countries, to take them up the value chain, so that they also, in the cycle of decarbonization, they develop and as well grow.
And Annika, when you look at developing countries and the green transition, how much political will do you see there behind the green transition? Or is it still this same argument that, you know, you in the developed world got to develop your economies and pollute, and we reserve the right to do the same?
I think we need to be realistic that the solutions and the roadmaps to green, or for the green transition, will differ across the world, and that's also very important to keep in mind, that the solutions will be different. However, I think that the recognition is, as it is in the developed world, it is in the developing world, that being smarter with the resources that you have, being able to transition to clean energy, the benefits are enormous. When we look at the challenges that the developing world has, for example, with air pollution, and if we're able to transition to clean energy and ensure that the populations will actually benefit from renewables, it is the benefits are there for taking. And the good thing is that as the prices of these technologies are coming down, these are actually in the reach for the developing world as well. So I think that the recognition is there, and we see really impressive movement in this direction, for example, in India today. So I think that it's just a matter of time that we are all building on this momentum, and I think that it is really, who is not to like what's happening and what are the solutions available, because they really can provide multiple benefits for economy and society as well as for the planet.
Yes, so I can tell you, having just tried to drive to Ohio for a football match in our new electric car, there were not enough chargers between New York and Ohio. But so we've laid out the headwinds and the landscape, but we need to talk about in more detail about what should be done to achieve the green transition despite these political headwinds. So Mark-Simon, you were talking a little bit about the need for clarity on carbon pricing. What do you feel really needs to be done? What's on your to-do list?
Yes, I think first of all the recognition that we have to do something. As I think Annika said, right, we have to act now. It's time, basically. Number one, we need to have the commitment from the corporate side, really to walk the talk, to say what we do and do what we say, fundamentally important. But corporates also need to have that incentives in order to invest. I mean, we need to ensure that we also earn our money. I often get the question of, well, who's going to pay for it? By the way, it's us. It's our planet. It's all of us, right? So, but to have the right incentives in place, as I mentioned before, the carbon pricing is a very important element in here to drive this. Availability of, I mean, here Carl was talking about the raw material side, but it's also the energy side. We need to have an international cooperation and an alignment on this topic, and we need to continue the dialogue and drive the green transition together forward. We also need support from the governmental side, but also from the financing side as well, right? We need to have frameworks which are supporting then investments into green transition as well, to take off some of the risk which might be there, right? If you have larger projects not really hitting the criteria of, I say, maybe hedge funds or you name it, but to take off some risk and to make them much more attractive. That is what we need.
And Cal, do you feel like that also at Hitachi? I mean, what would make you feel even more confident about investing in green energy? A better regulatory framework, more government stability?
I would say that the investments that are currently being in place by the public sector is a great initial step, but there has to be more steps towards increasing the reach of those funds. So for example, we have been running multiple cases to identify customers that the business case will pencil out for them. And it is penciling out for some regions, for example, in the US. But there are some regions where with the energy price is really low, it's not penciling out. So sometimes you get a positive net present value, but sometimes also there are still negative net present value. So this segment has to increase. We need to fine tune this part further to cover a wider segment of the market. The private is the same. I talked about the public-private collaboration. It has to help to bridge the gap of incentives, either with several tools that the government can put in place, but also to de-risk this project so that the appetite is open for much larger segment of and types of projects that are there.
And Vamsi, how much investment is there? You track investment across the globe in like clean aviation fuel, for example. Is that one of those difficult areas where people aren't really investing?
Much smaller than like what's going into solar and wind, right? And again, if you think through the maturity cycle, again, for example, like last year, close to $500 billion went into solar globally, and that literally doubled from 4 years ago. And as I know one of you were mentioning, at COP28, there was a goal to triple renewable capacity by the end of the decade and double energy efficiency, right? So I think the renewable side of the equation is getting, I mean, there's still more dollars that needs to go in there, but I think that's pointing in the right direction. But to your point on the harder to abate sectors, like if you pick sustainable aviation fuel or green hydrogen and all of the likes there, it's still like very small. There's a lot of like technology that evolution that needs to happen. And the way I think about it is, look, there is the investment need, which is clear, how much investment needs to go into different areas. And then there is investment opportunities that a private investor or private sector is looking at. And there is a gap, right? Like that gap needs to be supported by clear like long-term policy, which is where like something like an Inflation Reduction Act or what EU policy is coming in is trying to, while the technology scales and the cost curves come down, there is a need for like sort of long-term like clear policy that companies can sort of like rely upon and pursue the projects.
Well, we don't have that in the US, do we, right now?
That is a challenge right now, right? Like in that sense, like again, the Inflation Reduction Act right now has some items in place, which if they're seen through, will help the companies think through there. But again, it's important to keep in mind one thing, right? Like so, most of the projects in clean energy transition are what we would call front-end capital expenditure heavy, right? So for example, if you think of a solar plant, you have to finance a certain number of dollars and then build the plant. And the cost of operating that plant tends to be like smaller in nature or lower in nature. Whereas in the fossil side of the equation, the initial cost might be lower, but you need ongoing expenditure, right? So what this means is a lot of the technologies in clean energy transition need robust like financing pipelines, like where you can raise the capital that is needed. Again, with the interest rates being high for the last a couple of years, that's been a bit of headwind. So again, if as the interest rates come down, maybe you can start seeing like more capital flowing into like difficult to finance projects.
Well, one country that doesn't have a problem with long-term planning, or apparently with financing, because it runs its own show, is China. And do you see China as being completely committed, Annika, to the green transition? Do you see any wavering there? I know it's partly, of course, fueled by burning coal, but nonetheless, they are killing it on solar power compared to the rest of the world.
I think China makes a very interesting case in a way that they are a major player in producing renewables, electric vehicles today. But then at the same time, how they are contributing to the green transition is not actually all that good for human rights, their climate environmental footprint, both within as well as outside China, raises serious questions around what is the cost of this transition model that they are providing. So I think that it is essential that we keep on challenging China on this model that they provide for the green transition. Then at the same time, I am also grateful in a way that they have helped to provide much more affordable solutions for the developing world, which most likely developing world would not have been able to afford without China's help. So it is a recognition that the transition to some extent has been speeded up by China's support. However, going forward, it is extremely important also for the West to recognize the challenges that China does create for its own green transition. And here I would like to actually mention something that whenever you're attending a discussion on clean energy transition or green transition in the EU or US, the discussion always goes down to, but then the access to the resources, the critical materials. We're so dependent on China. This is going to kill it. We'll not be able to make it. Let's just stick to the past because we can't actually have access to those resources. And I think that it's essential that we stop going back to the past, start thinking innovatively. How is it that we actually react to these pressures, this challenge created by China? And here I think that we need much, much more discussion about how do we become much smarter with the resources that we have within our own borders. And here circular economy comes into the picture. And how do we actually keep the value of products and materials in the economy, be it via reuse, repair, recycling, remanufacturing, and then at the end with recycling. And we are able to access enormous amount of critical materials within our own borders. So let's not think that we don't have solutions. We have solutions, and circular economy is one of them.
Solutions we have. And just before we open it out to the floor, Mark, Simon, I have to ask you the final question, which is where is the money coming from for all of this?
Where's the money coming from?
You have to make a living. You are a company.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have demonstrated that profitability and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. We have reduced 27% of our emissions already by the end of last year. We helped our customers to reduce their emissions last year by 12 million tons of CO2, right? So that is definitely something to recognize. But yes, going forward, also that requires for us to make investments further to go down the line to become a 42% reduction in our emissions, and even long term, hopefully, to come to neutrality at some point in time, right? That needs innovation, that needs R&D, that needs investments, and hence, again, on a global scale, we need to ensure that we continue the dialogue and make sure that we have the right incentives. And again, coming back to the point, at the end of the day, it's us who are saving the planet and who are going to pay for it as well. I think we need to recognize, and thank you very much, Annika, for the topic of circular economy as well here. I mean, we in Outokumpu, we drive 95% recycled material content in our production, right? This is record high. But where's the will, there's a way, right? You need to be innovative in that area as well. And I think, and we as a company, we don't need more things on this planet, but we need things which last longer.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank our panelists very much and open it up to the floor because we have time for a few questions. Does anybody have a question? If you could say, by the way, who you are and who you're directing your question to, that would be very helpful. Do you want to raise your hand, anyone who has a question? Don't be shy. We've had a great turnout. Madam, yes. Who are you and what's your question and to whom, please?
If you ask me, we have now just recently launched a new product line, which we call Circle Green. And by the way, that is 93% lower than the global average in terms of emissions. Here we are receiving a premium on the market as well. That's right. But my point is more going forward, right? And not to say who's paying for the premium, who is receiving a premium and so forth, but really giving the incentive for companies. If you do not invest, if you do not develop further into the reduction of your carbon emissions, that will come as a cost. For me, this is more a license to operate question than anything else. Does that answer your question?
In a circular way, very good. Madam, I think you can. The steel industry.
The steel industry.
Yeah.
Affected
by
what?
electromobility.
Yes, I think we are certainly an industry with our product and with the product characteristics supporting here. If you think about mobility in terms of electric vehicles, then we are going to produce the frame and the box in order to protect the battery in here. But we're also providing solutions in terms of for security for vehicles, and also reducing weight and providing strength based on the material which we are providing.
Does anyone have a question not for Mark Simon, for for our other panelists? Sir.
That's a good question. So when we advise like companies, like we always, you want to have a base case and you always want to have a like risk case, right? Like for example, again, if you're saying that if there is a big pullback in terms of supportive environment for pursuing certain technologies, you have to model that out and in your model and see, well, how much support do I really need in terms of like the margin that I'm making? And as a company, like as a technology that I'm working on, do I have the cost curve that will reduce in time so that like I'm not dependent on external support? Maybe in some industries like that support is needed for 3 years, 4 years, and if you feel that there is a high likelihood that you won't get that support, then maybe you think of other things. But if it's 2 years, then you figure out, okay, if I change this support, like what does the math mean, and go from there. So yes, as with any sort of prudent like CEO or a CFO who's thinking about this, you have to model it out. I don't think you can go blind into this, but I don't think, again, given how the costs have been coming down, and pick any technology, right? Like pick solar, pick recycling, pick battery, the costs have been consistently coming down, and all of these models will need to stand their own feet on their own feet like very soon. So There is no generic answer, but I think you can model it out.
Good question. We've got time for one more question before we wrap. Anybody else got a question from the floor? Sir.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm from a think tank called Energy for Growth Hub. This question is for Annika. I'm curious to know more about your thoughts on what an increased Chinese footprint in energy investments in developing regions has for an outcome in your mind. What do you see as the biggest risks, and what could be some positive outcomes of it? It kind of touches on Cal's point of de-risking investment from the West, but I'm more curious on what you see as the risks from the Chinese investments.
I think that we are really at crossroads. We don't yet fully know how this game is going to play out. I think that on one hand, China is having obviously a huge impact, and we in the West need to be prepared that this is basically what we are seeing is a competition between different systems, different approaches, and that ultimately we need to try to be smarter in the West with the resources that we have, and can we actually outcompete the Chinese model? I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but I think that we're really at crossroads, and I think everyone is battling with how to move forward with China, and how do we also keep China in the game? Because as we're discussing about the collective need for collective action, we do need to find ways to work together.
Cal, did you want to come in on that question?
I would say that it's, again, it has to be part of the mix as part of the long-term strategy. Remember today that the US have 8% of the cars sold are EVs. The plan is to reach to 50% in 2030. So that's 50%, from 8 to 50%. The plan to be 100% in 2050. So 2030, that's 6 years away. Who has the capacity? The US doesn't still have the capacity. So to reach to this capacity from 8 to 50 in 6 years, which country can help to do that? So this is where I'm saying that the international institutions needs to play a role, because without global cooperation, without the globalization of the supply chain, access to the raw material, access to the components, access to this manufacturing capacity that has been built up in some countries, there is very big challenge to achieve the goals that we have over the years.
Well, I think, sorry, just 1 second in here. Absolutely, I'm fully with you. But it then needs also to be clear when we think about raw materials and producing certain raw materials, we need to have a common understanding that that needs to be produced in a clean and environmental friendly way, and not only on the environmental side, but also on the human rights side, as Annika mentioned as well. Because there I see a significant dip and difference basically in there.
Well, thank you all so much to our panelists for that fascinating session, in which, I don't know about all of you, but I came away feeling quite optimistic that despite the fact that it is, to put it mildly, a complex geopolitical situation, Vamsi is pointing out that a lot of investment has been made. It's unlikely to be clawed back by a change of administration. Cal was also saying that there's a large amount of investment, but asking for the international financial institutions to do more for more clarity, to bridge the gap between aspiration and policy. And Annika was pointing out that few countries put human rights at the top of the green transition, but more should. And then we had Mark Simon, of course, leading the way with what Outokumpu themselves have done and challenging everybody else to be sustainable in the same way that they have been. So I would like to thank Outokumpu for hosting this, to all our panelists and to all of you for coming here today, and I wish you an enjoyable Climate Week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.